Hey guys, we're going to be talking about Ephesians 2:15 in this video, and there is quite a lot that needs to be addressed concerning this one verse, so let's get started. So Ephesians 2:15 says, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, for to make in himself of twain one new man, so making peace. So the part of this verse that we're mainly going to be focused on is the first half of it that says, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances. Now, when it comes to this law of commandments contained in ordinances, there are four interpretations that I have seen going around. The first one we'll call the mainstream Christian world interpretation. This is what a lot of churches today teach, that Jesus has abolished the law because it says the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so it is automatically assumed that this is speaking of the law and all of the commandments and ordinances that are associated with it. The second interpretation says that this law of commandments contained in ordinances is referring to the sacrificial laws. That would be pertaining to any type of law or commandment or statute that is connected to the sacrifices and the offerings. The third interpretation says that this law of commandments and ordinances is referring to the ceremonial laws. Now, I have no idea where these ceremonial laws are at because you will find no such description anywhere in the Bible, and I have yet to figure out exactly what commandments or laws actually fit into this category. So far, I can only assume that the Sabbath, the dietary laws, and the feast days would be included in that category. The fourth interpretation says that this law of commandments contained in ordinances is referring to a certificate of debt. And this is in reference to Colossians 2:14, where Paul says that Yeshua has blotted out the handwriting of ordinances. So we're going to be talking about Colossians 2:14 a little later because I'm going to show you the connection between Colossians 2 and Ephesians 2. So the first thing that I want to do is take a look at the Greek because there are some translation issues here that need to be addressed. The first thing is these two words here, even and contained. They are in italics, which means that they were added by the translators. They are not found in the Greek. And these words were added by the translators hoping to clarify or strengthen the meaning. Now, in some cases, these italicized words do not do any harm to the text. It doesn't distort it, and it's not misleading. But in other places, they don't belong there because it does distort. Now, in the case of Ephesians 2:15, these two words here, even and contained, are not really doing any harm. So I don't really see an issue with them being inserted here. However, because they're not found in the text, and I want to try to stay as accurate as I can, from this point forward, I am not going to say even or contained when I read this. So I'm going to open up the tools. By the way, I am using blueletterbible.com, or actually .org. This is a Bible website that I often use. So I'm going to open up the tools here to get to the Greek. And the phrase that we want to look for is the law of commandments in ordinances. So here it is right there. So what we have here is ton, which is the definite article, that would be the. We have nomen, which would be law. We have ton, which would be of. Entelon, commandments. In, which is also translated as in. And then we have the word dogmasin, and this is translated as ordinances. So we have ton nomen, ton entelon, in dogmasin. The law of commandments in ordinances. Now this is the word here that I want to concentrate on. It comes from the root word, which would be dogma down here. And if we were to do a search for this word, what's interesting about it is that in all the places in the New Testament, except for two, it's always translated as decrees. So you can see here in Luke chapter 2, verse 1, it's talking about the decree from Caesar Augustus. In Acts 16, it's talking about the decrees, which we're going to talk about Acts 16 a little later. Also in Acts chapter 17, it's also the decrees of Caesar. But then we get here to Ephesians 2 and Colossians 2, and suddenly now it's translated as ordinances. Now, why was it translated here as ordinances in these two places? Well, to be honest, I don't know. It could have been done by accident, or there could have been some agenda where they thought Jesus has abolished the law, and they changed it to ordinances to be misleading. I honestly don't know, but I do find it odd that it was translated here as ordinances. Now, if we go back up to the top and we check out the Septuagint, we can see that it's found in 12 different places in the Septuagint. So I'm going to click on the first one here. And you'll notice that all of these are from the book of Daniel. And you can also see that it's translated as decree. And it's always referring to the decree of a king. So just like back when we checked on these places in the New Testament writings, it was always referring to the decrees of men. Now, if Ephesians 2:15 is talking about the law of God, and these ordinances are referring to the ordinances that are in the law, then why do we not see any examples here coming from Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, or Deuteronomy? Clearly, this is not referring to the law of God or the ordinances of God. This is referring to the decrees of men. So we'll click on the last two examples here. And once again, from the book of Daniel. Now, you might notice that here in Daniel 3:12, you do not see the word decree. And the reason for that is because this is actually the English, which is coming from the King James Version, which is coming from the Masoretic Hebrew text. So even though it's telling us that it's found in the Septuagint, this has actually given us the Hebrew into English. So we need to go over and check out the Septuagint. So I'm just going to use another website, which gives us the comparison between the two, the Masoretic over here, which is King James, and the Septuagint. And we want to go to Daniel chapter 3, down to verse 12. There are certain Jews whom thou hast appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who have not obeyed thy decree, O king. So once again, we see the word decree, and it is referring to a man-made decree, in this case, the king. So what we see here is that this word dogma and all of its various forms, it is always referring to the decrees of men, and it is never used in reference to the law of God. So here in Ephesians 2:15, this word ordinances should have been translated as decrees. So what exactly is this law of commandments in decrees? And why did Yeshua have to abolish it? Well, we need to make sure that we get some context, because if we just pluck this one verse out of context, we can make this say whatever we want it to say, and I don't want to do that. So we want to make sure that we include the context. So we want to back up a few verses, and I think we can go back to around verse 11. He says, "Wherefore remember that you being in time past Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by that which is called the circumcision in the flesh made by hands." Now, there are two groups that Paul is making reference here to. The uncircumcision, that's talking about the Gentiles, and the circumcision, that's talking about the Jews. So he continues on in verse 12, that at that time you were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope, and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who sometimes were far off are made nigh by the blood of Christ. For he is our peace, who has made both one. Okay, well, hang on just a minute. Who is this both that's being spoken of here? It would be the two groups that he mentioned up here in verse 11, the Jew and the Gentile, or the uncircumcised and the circumcised. So he is our peace, who has made both the Jew and the Gentile one, and has broken down the middle wall of partition between us. Now the words between us, again, they are italicized here, but it's not really doing any harm. So what exactly is this middle wall of partition? So we know that in the time of the first century, when the temple was still standing, that there was a physical wall that had been built in the court of the temple. But this wall was not a commandment that had come from God. This was something that men had done in order to prevent the Gentiles from crossing over. Now, some of the remnants of the wall have been recovered, and there was a sign with an engraving on it, and I'm going to show it to you here. This is part of the stone slab that was recovered, and right here it says, and I'm going to highlight it, it says, "No foreigner or Gentile may enter within the balustrade around the sanctuary and the enclosure. Whoever is caught, on himself shall he put blame for the death which will ensue." Well, that's a pretty serious warning. So obviously there was a physical wall there in the first century, but I don't believe that's the wall that Paul was talking about when he said that Yeshua has broken it down. And the reason why I say that is because there's no mention anywhere in the Gospels where it says Yeshua told his disciples, "Okay, boys, go grab your pickaxes and your sledgehammers because we're going to go knock down the wall." There's no mention of anything like that. Not to mention that this wall was still standing in Paul's day long after Yeshua had already ascended. So clearly Yeshua did not break down the physical wall. So that means that what Paul is doing here is he's using the physical wall metaphorically to show that this law of commandments and decrees, it's doing the same thing that the physical wall did, which was causing hostility and causing division between the Jew and the Gentile. All right, so back over to Ephesians chapter 2, verse 14, "For he is our peace, who has made both the Jew and the Gentile one, and has broken down the middle wall of partition between us, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, the law of commandments in decrees." Now notice he says here the enmity. This word enmity would mean hostility or hatred. That means that this law of commandments in decrees is causing enmity. Who is it creating hostility and anger and enmity between? The Jew and the Gentile. So what Paul is saying is that the law of commandments in decrees is creating enmity and division. It's acting as the middle wall of partition. So just like the physical wall divided between the Jew and the Gentile, this law of commandments and decrees is also dividing between the Jew and the Gentile. The physical wall was causing hostility, and this law of commandments and decrees is also causing hostility. So now we need to ask the question, does the law of God create division and enmity between the Jew and the Gentile? So let's go take a look in the law and see what the law has to say for itself. So we can start by going over to Exodus. And let's start in chapter 12. We're going to go down to verse 19. 7 days shall there be no leaven found in your houses, for whosoever eats that which is leavened, even that soul shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he be a stranger, the Gentile, or born in the land. So here we see the Gentile included in with this. We can also go down to verses 48 and 49. "And when a stranger shall sojourn with thee, and will keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and let him come near and keep it. And he shall be as one that is born in the land, for no uncircumcised person shall eat thereof. One law shall be to him that is homeborn, and unto the stranger that sojourns among you." Now notice it says here in verse 48, "And he," referring to the Gentile, "shall be as one that is born in the land." In other words, a native-born Israelite. That does not sound like division to me. That sounds like everybody is supposed to be the same, and we're all supposed to follow the same rules. Let's go to Exodus chapter 20, and we're going to go down to verse 10. "But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, your manservant, nor your maidservant, nor your cattle, nor the stranger that is within thy gates." Stranger would be Gentile. So once again, we see that the Gentiles are included. And this has to do with the Sabbath. Now, there's a lot of people that say that the Sabbath was never for the Gentiles, but here it clearly says, yes, it is. Now, we could go a little bit further with this, and we can go over to Leviticus chapter 16. And we want to go down to verses 29 through 31. I think it's where it's at. And this shall be a statute forever unto you, that in the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall afflict your souls and do no work at all, whether it be one of your own country or a stranger, Gentile, that sojourns among you. For on that day shall the priest make an atonement for you, to cleanse you, that you may be clean from all your sins before the Lord. So here we have the Gentiles being included in the Day of Atonement. Now we can also go over to the next chapter, Leviticus 17, and we can go down to verse 8. And thou shalt say unto them, whatsoever man there be of the house of Israel, or of the strangers which sojourn among you, that offer a burnt offering or sacrifice, and brings it not unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation to offer it unto the Lord, even that man shall be cut off from among his people. So here we see the Gentiles being included in the tabernacle offerings. So we can keep going. And whatsoever man there be of the house of Israel, or of the stranger, the Gentiles that sojourn among you, that eats any manner of blood, I will even set my face against that soul that eats blood, and will cut him off from among his people. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes an atonement for the soul. Therefore I said unto the children of Israel, no soul of you shall eat blood, neither shall any stranger or Gentile that sojourns among you eat blood. And whatsoever man there be of the children of Israel, or of the strangers that sojourn among you, which hunts and catches any beast or fowl that may be eaten, he shall even pour out the blood thereof, and cover it with dust. Verse 15, and every soul that eats that which died of itself, or that which was torn with beast, whether it be one of your own country or a stranger, he shall both wash his clothes, and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the even, then shall he be clean. So again, we see all of these examples of the Gentiles being included in these dietary restrictions, and in the understanding of the states of being clean and unclean. So at this point, is anybody seeing anything here that would be considered hostility or division? It's actually the opposite. Gentiles are included in these things, and it says that they are to be looked upon as if they were a native born. So let's look at some more examples. So we could go over to Leviticus 18, and we'll go down to verse 26. Now keep in mind, Leviticus 18 is the sexual immorality chapter, which talks about all of the immoral sexual things that the nations were doing, and he told them not to do it. So Leviticus 18:26 says, you shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not commit any of these abominations, neither any of your own nation, nor any stranger that sojourns among you. Now we can also go over here to the next chapter, chapter 19, and we'll go down to verse 34. But the stranger that dwells with you shall be unto you as one born among you, and thou shalt love him as thyself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Now I think Leviticus 19:34 right here is pretty good evidence to say that the law of commandments and decrees that's causing hostility and division is not referring to the law of God. Because it's very clear right here in the law. It states, the stranger or the Gentile that dwells with you shall be unto you as though he were a native-born Israelite, and you shall love him as yourself. Does that sound like division? Does that sound like enmity and hostility? No, of course not. It's the complete opposite. Now, there's also another example we can use in Numbers chapter 15. And by the way, I'm just giving you a few of these. There's actually quite a lot of these places where we see this. I'm just going through some of the popular ones. So we're going to go down here to verse, let's see, I think it's verse 14. And if a stranger or Gentile sojourns with you, or whosoever be among you in your generations, and will offer an offering made by fire, of a sweet savor unto the Lord, as you do, so shall he do. One ordinance shall be both for you of the congregation, and also for the stranger that sojourns with you. an ordinance forever in your generations. As you are, so shall the stranger be before the Lord. One law and one manner shall be for you and for the stranger that sojourns with you. Does this sound like division? Does this sound like hostility? I think the answer is no. Clearly, Ephesians 2:15 is not talking about the law of God, because the law states that Gentiles have always been welcome to come in, that there's not supposed to be a difference or a separation or a division between the two. So if this law of commandments and decrees in Ephesians 2:15, if that's not referring to the law of God, then what exactly is it referring to? Well, unfortunately, the answer to this question is not going to be found in your Bible. The problem here is that there is a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that's just not written here. There's a lot of stuff that's going on in the first century that is just not found in your Bible. We're going to have to look to other writings in order to get this information to kind of fill in some of the blanks in order to give us some context of what's going on. So in the time of the first century, there were two very well-known Pharisees or rabbis that had their own schools, and they taught the interpretation of the law. These two men were Shammai and Hillel. Now when it came to the school of Shammai, they would have been a ultra-conservative religious group of fundamentalists with a pathological devotion to obeying a whole bunch of man-made traditions and commandments. They believed that the Hebrew descendants of Abraham were the only people that were beloved of God, and so this meant that salvation was only available to the Jews. Now, this caused a lot of hatred and division between these Shammaiite Pharisees and the Gentile converts. Now, on the other hand, the school of Hillel was far more liberal. Hillel was known for welcoming in Gentiles, and his interpretation of the law was far more lenient compared to the strict interpretation that Shammai was teaching. There is an incident that is spoken of in the Talmud, and I'm going to show it to you here. It's in Shabbat 31a, and this talks about the Gentile that went before Shammai and Hillel, and it says, "There was another incident involving one Gentile who went before Shammai, and said to Shammai, 'Convert me on condition that you teach me the entire Torah while I am standing on one foot.' Shammai pushed him away with the builder's cubit in his hand. This was a common measuring stick, and Shammai was a builder by trade. That same Gentile came before Hillel. Hillel converted him and said to him, 'That which is hateful to you do not do to another.' That is the entire Torah, and the rest is its interpretation. Go study." So here we see an example of Shammai being very strict, not allowing the Gentiles to come in and pushing them away, whereas Hillel not only converted him, but told him to go and study. Now, at one point, a problem erupted over the issues of Gentiles and uncleanness. And this is when we see the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel meet together to try to resolve some of these issues. So once again, we're going to read here from the Talmud, and this is going to be Shabbat 13b. And it says, "And these are among the halakot that the sages who went up to visit him said in the upper story of Hananiah ben Hezekiah ben Gerin. The precise nature of these halakot will be explained in the Gemara. These halakot are considered one unit because they share a distinctive element. Since many sages were there, among them most of the generation's Torah scholars in Eretz Israel, they engaged in discussion of various halakot of the Torah. It turned out that when the people expressing opinions were counted, the students of Bet Shammai, Bet would be house, so the students of the house of Shammai outnumbered the students of the house of Hillel, and they issued decrees with regard to 18 matters on that day in accordance with the opinion of Bet Shammai." This is where we see the 18 edicts or the 18 measures, or as it says here, the 18 matters. Now, it's also important to note that it says that they issued decrees. So here we have some man-made decrees issued with the house of Shammai concerning this halakot of the Torah. Now, it's also spoken of in the Talmud that this day when this happened was very grievous for Israel. So we're going to go look at Shabbat 17a. And here it says, Shammai said to him, speaking to Hillel, if you provoke me and insist that there is no difference between gathering olives and grapes, then in order not to contradict this, I will decree impurity on the gathering of olives as well. They related that since the dispute was so intense, they stuck a sword in the study hall, and they said, one who seeks to enter the study hall, let him enter, and one who seeks to leave may not leave, so that all of the sages will be assembled to determine the halakha. That day, Hillel was bowed and was sitting before Shammai like one of the students. Now, why is this important to note? The Gemara said, and that day was as difficult for Israel as the day the golden calf was made, as Hillel, who was the Nasi, or president, was forced to sit in submission before Shammai. So this means that Hillel was the president of the Sanhedrin. So here we have the president of the Sanhedrin who is sitting in submission before Shammai. And the opinion of Bet Shammai prevailed in the vote conducted that day. And Shammai and Hillel issued the decree, and the people did not accept it from them. And their students came and issued the decree, and the people accepted it from them. Now, unfortunately, these 18 edicts, or 18 measures, or 18 matters, these 18 things that were decreed were lost when the temple was destroyed. However, some of them are spoken of here in the Talmud, and I'm going to show you one of them. So if we go over to Mishnah Oholot 18, it says here, if one buys a field in Syria near the land of Israel, if he can enter it in cleanness, it is deemed cleaned and is subject to the laws of tithes and, I believe this is pronounced shivait, produce. But he cannot enter it in cleanness. It is deemed unclean, but it is still subject to the laws of tithes and shivait, produce. Now pay close attention to what it says next. The dwelling places of non-Jews are unclean. That sounds rather familiar, doesn't it? If we were to go over to Acts chapter 10, and I think it's going to be down in verse 28. So verse 28, this would be Peter speaking to Cornelius, because remember, he was going to the house of Cornelius. And keep in mind that Cornelius is not a Jew, he is a Gentile, or a God-fearer. It says, and he, Peter, said unto them, you know how that it is an unlawful thing for a man that is a Jew to keep company or come unto one of another nation, in other words, a Gentile. But God has showed me that I should not call any man common or unclean. Now, why would Peter say that it is unlawful for him to keep company or go into the house of a Gentile, being Cornelius? Why would he say it's unlawful? Does the law of God speak of any such thing? No, it doesn't say anything like that. Clearly, this is not speaking of the law of God. This is referring to one of those decrees that was issued by Shammai. Shammai had issued those decrees and said that it is unlawful to go into the house of a Jew. You cannot eat from them. You cannot buy from them. That their dwelling places are unclean. And Peter knew this. That's why Peter said, it's unlawful for me to keep company with you. You're a Gentile. But thankfully, God showed Peter in the vision that he should not call any man common or unclean. So these decrees that were issued by Shammai, I think it's pretty obvious that they caused a lot of hostility, a lot of enmity and hatred between the Jews and the Gentiles. Not only that, but it definitely caused division and acted as a dividing wall, separating the two. So let's go back to Ephesians chapter 2, and let's do some reverse engineering. Now, when I say reverse engineering, what I mean is let's just read this backwards. So here we have the word ordinances, which should be decrees. So we have some man-made decrees. And in these man-made decrees, there are some commandments. And these commandments are acting as law. So let's go over that one more time. There are some decrees that were issued by Shammai. And in these decrees issued by Shammai, there are some commandments. And these commandments were enacted as law. That's why Peter said it is unlawful to go into the house of Cornelius, because he was a Gentile. And what did Shammai say? The dwelling places of Gentiles are unclean. This is the only interpretation that makes sense here for Ephesians chapter 2. No other interpretation fits the context. Remember the 4 interpretations I gave you back at the beginning of the video? Let's quickly go through those and see if any of those fit here. So, the law of God. Does the law of God create division and enmity and hatred between the Jew and the Gentile? No, of course it doesn't. It says that they are to be one and they're to all follow the same set of rules. So it cannot be the law of God. The second interpretation was the sacrificial system and all of its laws. Does the sacrificial law create a wall of partition or division between Jew and Gentile? No, of course it doesn't, because I read to you earlier that it said that the Gentile was to make the same sacrifices as the native-born Israelite. The third interpretation was the ceremonial laws. Does the Sabbath, the feast days, and the dietary laws, does that create division between Jew and Gentile? Does that create enmity and hostility? No, of course it doesn't. So that can't be the right answer either. What about the fourth interpretation, the certificate of debt? Does a certificate of debt cause division between Jew and Gentile? I don't see how it can, because both groups are guilty. It's not like one group is innocent and the other group is guilty. They're all guilty of sin. How can a certificate of debt cause division? How can a certificate of debt cause enmity and hatred between the Jew and the Gentile? Let's go take a look at Colossians chapter 2 really quick. So we'll go over to Colossians chapter 2. We'll go down to verse 14, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances. Now you should already know, if you've seen one of my previous videos, what word is used here. It's the word dogmasin, the same word found over in Ephesians 2. So this should say the handwriting of decrees. What decrees are being spoken of here? Is this referring to a certificate of debt? Well, there's nothing here that says anything about debt or owing anything. It says hierographone, which would be hiero, the hand, graphone, writing. So that would be something written with the hand. So handwriting would be correct. Handwriting of dogmasin, decrees. Well, if we're going to stay consistent, then these decrees have to be man-made decrees. So what decrees are being spoken of here? Well, if we go on down to the bottom of the chapter, he says here in verse 20, wherefore, if you are dead with Christ from the rudiments of the world, why, as though living in the world, are you subject to ordinances? Would you like to take a guess at what word is used there? It's another form of the word dogma right here. So what exactly are these ordinances that the Colossians are subjecting themselves to? Touch not, taste not, handle not, which are all to perish with the using according to the commandments and doctrines of men. These are man-made decrees that the Colossians are subjecting themselves to. And he's asking them, why are you doing this? Because I just told you, Yeshua has blotted out these ordinances. Now, more specifically, this is referring to the ascetic decrees, because this would be the group of ascetics that are trying to influence the Colossians. So this is not an issue of somebody trying to get the Colossians to obey the law. It's actually the opposite. They were obeying the law, but then the ascetics came in and started subjecting them to their decrees of touch not, taste not, handle not. So I honestly do not see how this can be referring to some type of certificate of debt, because the Greek says nothing about a certificate of debt. It simply says hierographon dogmasin, a handwriting of decrees. And if we're going to stay consistent, then these decrees must be man-made decrees, which are later clarified at the bottom of the chapter as being the commandments and doctrines of men. So, as a little added bonus, I quickly want to look at some of the other versions of the Bible to see exactly what they say compared to everything I just showed you. So we're going to go over to Bible Hub, and we're going to take a look at a couple of these. So the NIV states, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. The New Living Translation says he did this by ending the system of law with its commandments and regulations. Now, of course, we know this is referring to the law of God, but of course that would be false. He did not end the law of God. The English Standard Version says, by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances. The Berean Study Bible says, abolishing in his flesh the law of commandments and decrees. Now, that one is almost correct because it says and when it should say in. It is not the law of commandments and decrees, it's the law of commandments in decrees. The Berean Literal says, having annulled in his flesh the law of commandments in ordinances. The New American Standard, the law of commandments contained in ordinances. King James, of course, is contained in ordinances. Let's see, the Christian Standard, he made of no effect the law consisting of commands and expressed in regulations. Okay, so here's a good one for you. The Contemporary English Version says, to destroy the law of Moses with all its rules and commands. That is a very bad interpretation. The Good News Translation says he abolished the Jewish law with its commands and rules. Well, that's kind of correct, although I think in the case of the Good News, they probably think the Jewish law is referring to the law of God, when actually the Jewish law would be referring to what Shammai set up. The Holem Christian Standard Bible says he made of no effect the law consisting of commands expressed in regulations. Again, commandments and regulations. Commandments in decrees. Oh, here's one. The Net Bible says when he nullified in his flesh the law of commandments in decrees. So the Net Bible got this one right. God's Word translation says he brought an end to the commandments and demands found in Moses' teaching. Oh yeah, that's a pretty bad one. By abolishing in his flesh the enmity, which is the law of commandments contained in ordinances. Again, a lot of these say the same thing about the law of commandments and ordinances. The Jubilee 2000 Bible says the law of commandments in the order of rights, which I'm not sure how they get rights out of that one. Let's see, where's another one? The law of commandments in ordinances. So over and over again, a lot of these say pretty much the same thing. Here's one here, the Dewey Rhines, making void the law of commandments contained in decrees. So that one would be right, although contained is not in the text. All right, so some of these are okay, I suppose. Other ones are pretty awful. But there's two more that I wanted to show you here. One of them is called the Mirror Bible. The Mirror Bible is a paraphrased Bible, and it says here in Ephesians 2:15, and I'm hoping that you can see this. Let me zoom in here a little bit to this, see if I can get a little closer. So it says, in his incarnation, he rendered the entire legal system under Moses useless as a measure to justify human life and conduct. That's a pretty bad one. Another Bible would be the Message Bible. And this one here says, he repealed the law code that had become so clogged with fine print and footnotes that it hindered more than it helped. Then he started over. Yeah, okay. So basically, according to this one, Jesus had to start over because the law code got too clogged up. So if you have the Message Bible or the Mirror Bible, you need to find the nearest active volcano and you need to chunk both of these Bibles into that volcano. If you can't find a volcano, then just find a fiery mountain and throw them in there because that is where they belong. So in conclusion, Ephesians 2:15, these decrees are not referring to anything out of the law of God. These are Shammai decrees that had been made, and in these decrees were commandments on what the Jews had to do concerning Gentiles. You can't buy from them. You can't sit and eat with them. Remember Galatians chapter 2, it says Peter was sitting and eating with the Gentiles? And then when those of the circumcision came, it says he got up and went and sat with some of the Jews. You remember that? Now I wonder who came up with those rules. Once again, that was probably some stuff that Shammai had enacted. So those decrees contain commandments, and those commandments were acting as law. That is what Ephesians 2:15 is talking about. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this video. So if you have any comments or any questions, feel free to comment below. I'm going to try to put a link to everything I used on here in the description to this video, just in case you want to go check it all out. So as always, guys, thank you for watching. And again, if you have any comments, questions, feel free to comment below. And I'll see you guys later.